The candles in the great dining room at Ashmore Park were lit to their full height, the night of the midsummer gathering, and the light they threw across the long mahogany table was warm and indiscriminate, touching the diamonds at Lady Whitmore's throat and the plain gray wool of the servant girl hovering near the sideboard with equal golden indifference. The Cecily did not move. That was the first discipline a servant learned, and she had learned it well in 8 weeks. Stand still, and you become part of the room's furniture. Move unexpectedly, and every eye finds you. She stood at the edge of the candlelight with her hands folded at her waist and her gaze fixed on the sideboard, where Mr. Aldous Crane had set down the decanter of port 12 minutes ago, and had not yet picked it up. He would pick it up soon. The meal was nearly over. The footmen were clearing the soup plates, and in the natural progression of a midsummer dinner, the port would be poured, and the ladies would withdraw, and Lord Ashmore would take the first glass, and she had perhaps 5 minutes to decide what she intended to do about it. The cloak she wore was gray wool, a half-size too large, borrowed from the household stores when her own traveling clothes had been locked away the first week. She had never asked to have them returned. The cloak was useful precisely because it was too large. It held everything, and no one looked twice at a servant girl swallowed inside a cloak that did not fit her. She watched Crane's hand settle on the decanter's neck. His ring caught the light. She had come here to catch him. She had not yet caught him in the manner that would count. And in approximately 4 minutes, the man she had come to protect would lift a glass to his mouth, and she would know whether she had been fast enough or whether she was, once again, too late. This was the particular shape of her fear, not that she was wrong, but that she was right and it would not matter. She breathed. She did not move. She watched his hand. 8 weeks earlier, in the 3rd week of April, Cecily Fairbrook had arrived at Ashmore Park, in a hired carriage, with 2 valises and a letter of introduction, written in the hand of Mrs. Coming. Pattinson, the head housekeeper of the estate, who had been a woman of the Fairbrook household before Cecily's father died, and the household had ceased to exist. The letter said that Clara Marsh, a woman of 24, had served in several respectable positions and came with good character and strong domestic skills. Every word of it was true of Cecily herself. The name was the only thing Mrs. Pattinson had fabricated, and she had done it with the precise efficiency of a woman who understood exactly how thin the distinction was between a gentlewoman in reduced circumstances and a servant, and who had decided that the distinction did not matter as much as keeping Cecily alive. Cecily had written to Mrs. Pattinson 6 weeks before her arrival, with a packet of information she had assembled across 2 years of painstaking work. She had a record of the sudden deaths of 3 men whose property had subsequently passed to a single beneficiary, a letter in Crane's hand she had obtained through a solicitor's clerk in Bath who had owed a debt to her father's memory, and a list of the apothecary's accounts she had traced through a merchant's ledger that showed regular purchases of arsenic powder billed to an estate account and signed with Crane's initials. She had taken this information first to the local magistrate in her own county. He had heard her with a patient smile, men of consequence reserved for women who brought papers to their offices, and then he had thanked her, done nothing. She had written to 2 solicitors in London. Their replies had been polite, and their silences had been longer. One of them had recommended that she speak with a ladies' society, as though the problem were one of grief management rather than systematic murder. Her father had died in November 2 years ago. 2 weeks after a dispute with a neighbor over a parcel of land he had refused to sell. The neighbor's steward had been an associate of Crane's. The coroner had said it was the heart. Cecily had held her father's cold hand, and known it was not the heart, but she had been 22, and she had had no letters and no ledgers then, only the knowledge in her body that the man in the ground had been full of life 4 days before, and the knowledge in her mind that she was the only person in the world who intended to do anything about it. Edmund Ashmore had died 6 months ago. Cecily had read the notice in the paper and had recognized the shape of the death immediately. Sudden illness, 48 hours, a man in his 30s who had been in good health. She had written to Mrs. Pattinson within the week. She could not go to the magistrate again. She could not afford another polite smile, and she did not have money for another solicitor. And the law had made it very clear that it had no particular interest in the concerns of a young woman without property or connections or a male relative to carry her grievance for her. She could go to Ashmore Park herself, and she could watch, and she could find what there was to find before Lord Ashmore drank his port one evening, and there was another notice in the newspaper. Pattinson had met her in the servants' hall on the morning of her arrival, a small woman with white hair and capable hands who had been the one person in Cecily's childhood who could be relied upon to say uncomfortable things with complete kindness. She had taken both of Cecily's hands and said nothing for a moment, looking at her face in the way of a woman reading a text she already knew but needed to verify. Then she said very quietly, "The Viscount comes home from Vienna in a fortnight. You will need to be careful." "I am always careful," Cecily said. Mrs. Plass. Pattinson looked at her with the expression she reserved for statements she found diplomatically insufficient. "Mr. Crane has been here 23 years," she said. "He is trusted by the family entirely, and by the household, and he is liked. He is good at being liked. Whatever you are doing, it must be done in such a way that when you have finished, there is nothing he can dismiss." She paused. "There is nothing I can dismiss from the way you looked in those letters. My dear, I am not the person you need to convince." Cecily understood. She unpacked her valises and settled into the room on the upper servants' corridor and went to work. The estate was large and well ordered, the kind of house that had been kept to its own patterns for so long that the patterns themselves were invisible. Crane ran the household accounts with the smooth authority of a man who had never been questioned, and the staff moved in their orbits around him with the uncritical ease of people who had never had reason to look twice. He was pleasant at the servants' dinner table. He remembered the names of the housemaids' families. He was the kind of man who was not merely tolerated but genuinely appreciated, and the first 2 weeks taught Cecily that this was the most dangerous thing about him. He had made himself necessary. She watched the sideboard. She watched who handled the food and drink, and when she learned the kitchen's rhythms, and which cellar footman was Crane's particular instrument, and which route the port decanter took from the cellar to the dining room. She was systematic about it. Her father had taught her to be systematic, and the years since his death had made her more so. The Viscount arrived on a Thursday, dismounting in the courtyard in a coat that had collected the dust of 3 counties, and Cecily watched from an upper corridor window because she had been carrying linens and the window was there and she had not been able to make herself look away. He was taller than she had expected from the portrait in the entrance hall. The portrait showed a young man of perhaps 25. Fair in the way of the Ashmores, with the polished indifference of a man who knew he was being painted. The man in the courtyard was not like the portrait. He was 34 and had a face that had learned something the painter had not put there, yet a particular gravity in the set of the jaw, and the steadiness of the eyes. And when he dismounted, he stood for a moment, with one hand on the horse's flank, and looked up at the house with an expression Cecily recognized without being able to name precisely. It was the expression of a man returning to a place where he expected to find someone who was no longer there. She stepped back from the window. She had not been sent to the window. She had not been sent to observe the Viscount's expression. She had work to do, and her work was not that, and she was careful, as she always was, about the difference between what she had come to do and what she was beginning to notice. She met him properly on the 3rd day of his residence, when she carried the morning tray to his study and found him already at his desk at 6:30, the shutters drawn back and the early light pooling across the papers in front of him. The study was large enough that she crossed it without disturbing him, set the tray at the corner of the desk, poured the tea, and was turning to leave when he looked up. She had expected to be looked through. Servants were looked through. It was the nature of the position, and she had made her peace with it. He did not look through her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the house from the courtyard, as though he were taking careful account of something that might matter. He said, "You are new." "Yes, my lord, Clara Marsh. I arrived 3 weeks ago." He said nothing more. She left. In the corridor outside the study door, she stood for a moment, with her hand against the cold plaster wall, and attended to the peculiar sensation of having been seen by someone whose attention she had not sought and was not certain she knew what to do with. She told herself it was an inconvenience. It was, in fact, a more complicated thing than that. But she did not have time for complicated things, and she went back to work. She met him again, 3 days later, in the portrait gallery, which she had been sent to dust in the absence of the upper housemaid. He was standing in front of the family portraits in the way of a man who had come here for a specific reason, and had not quite arrived at it. She worked along the near wall and did not address him. He stood for a long time in front of a portrait she could not see from her angle, and then he said, without turning, "You have been polishing the same frame for some minutes." She had not realized she had stopped moving. She said, "I beg your lordship's pardon." He turned. He looked at the frame she had been polishing, which was a landscape of no particular distinction, and then at her. "It does not require apology," he said, "only observation." He left the gallery. She went on with her work, and tried to determine what it was about him that made her more careful when he was in a room. It was not his rank, and it was not his reserve, and it was not the fact that she was deceiving him, though that was its own discomfort. It was that he paid attention. Attention was the one thing she had not prepared herself for. In the 5th week, she switched the decanters. She replaced the port from the sideboard with a matching decanter from the cellar, and carried the original to the apothecary in the village, wrapped in the grey cloak, under the cover of her half-day liberty. The apothecary was old and incurious, and did not ask why a servant woman needed a bottle of port analyzed. She paid him with the last of her quarter's salary. He confirmed, within an hour, what she had already suspected. She brought the report back to her room and sat with it on the small bed, and felt, for a precise moment, the specific cold satisfaction of being right, and then immediately afterwards the long weight of what right meant when you were dressed in borrowed grey wool, and the man you intended to expose was the most trusted figure in the household. She was, at this moment, a servant. The apothecary's report was paper. Crane was a gentleman of 23 years standing, and the evidence was in her hands, and the question was how to make it matter to the people who had the authority to act on it. She thought about the magistrate's smile. She thought about the solicitor's letters. She folded the report into her dress and went back to work, because she was not ready yet, and because she had not yet found the right moment, and because she was, if she was honest with herself, afraid that the right moment would require her to reveal herself before she was certain the evidence would hold. There was one evening in the 6th week that she had not planned for, and that had been the evening of Thomas's illness. Thomas Breen, the second footman, was a young man of 20, with a large family in Derbyshire, and a tendency to work longer hours than his station required. Because he was saving his wages for a purpose, he had not told anyone except Cecily, who had not asked but had been told anyway, in the comfortable manner of people who sensed in her a capacity for keeping things safe. He collapsed in the servants' corridor at 11:30 with a fever that came on so fast that the other servants simply stood, because the speed of it was frightening and none of them knew what to do about fear that arrives without announcement. Cecily was the one who knelt beside him. The decision was not a decision exactly. It was simply that she was there, and she could see that no one else had moved, and she had a very clear sense of what needed doing and who could do it. She sent the youngest housemaid for blankets, the kitchen girl for broth, and a verbal message with the coachman's boy to the apothecary, because the hour was too late for a written note, and she could tell by the color in Thomas's face that what he needed was speed. She sat with him on the stone floor of the corridor for 3 hours. She kept a damp cloth on his forehead and spoke to him when he was sensible, and sat quietly when he was not. The corridor was cold, and the grey cloak was thin at the elbows, and she did not think about any of that because Thomas was frightened, and there was nothing more useless in the world than a person who could help, but was attending to her own discomfort instead. She had not known Lord Ashmore was there until the floor creaked, and she looked up and found him standing in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, with his coat half off and a candlestick in his hand, watching her. She had no means of knowing how long he had been there. His face in the candlelight was very still. the particular stillness she had come to recognize as his genuine expression under everything else. He showed the room, and the look in his eyes was not the look she had expected from a man who had found a servant girl on his floor. She said, "I did not hear." "Your lordship, I did not announce myself," he said. He looked at Thomas. "How long has he been like this?" "Since 11:30, my lord. I have sent for the apothecary." He came into the corridor and crouched down to look at Thomas's face, and she was very aware of his proximity, the warmth of him against the cold stone, closer than she had been to him before, outside of the study's careful formality. He looked at Thomas with the attention he gave to most things, which was more attention than most men gave to anything. Then he stood. "You sent from your own half-day liberty's wages," he said. She had not expected him to know that. She said, "I had no leave to use the household account at this hour." "I see," he said. He did not go. He stayed at the edge of the doorway, and she returned her attention to Thomas. And there was a silence that was not uncomfortable in the way she would have expected. It had the quality of two people who had separately decided to be present in the same place, which was different from company and different from solitude, and felt, in the cold of the corridor, like something she did not have a Regency-appropriate name for. After a while he said very quietly, as though he were speaking to the corridor rather than to her, "My brother liked this corridor. There is a window at the end that faces east." He stopped. "Forgive me. That is not a relevant observation." "No, my lord," she said. And then, because she could not help it, "I'm sorry about your brother." He did not answer for a moment. Then he nodded once, small and precise, the nod of a man acknowledging a weight rather than setting it down. He walked away down the corridor. She heard his footsteps, until she did not, and then she heard nothing but Thomas's breathing, which was evening slowly toward something more like sleep, and she sat in the quiet and kept watch until the apothecary came. In the following week, Lord Ashmore said when she set down the morning tray. "You may sit if you like," she said. "I beg your pardon, my lord, there are 2 chairs," he said. "I find I would prefer not to be alone this morning." "You are not required to stay." She stayed. She sat in the chair by the window and he poured his tea himself, and neither of them said anything, and she looked out at the park, where the May light was soft on the grass, and he read his letters, and it was one of the strangest half-hours she had spent in 2 years, because it was also, she thought, one of the most comfortable. And she did not entirely know what to do with that information. When she stood to leave, he said, still reading, "Thank you, Miss Marsh," and she said, "Of course, my lord," and went out into the corridor, and stood for a moment with the tray, and tried to organize herself back into the person she had been before she sat down. The study had a portrait of Edmund on the north wall, half hidden by a fold of velvet curtain. She noticed the curtain the first week and left it alone. On the morning of the 6th visit to the study, the curtain was pulled back, and the portrait was visible. A young man of perhaps 30, fair-haired and light in the face, with a kind expression and the air of a man who was happier to be looking at the world than to be looked at. Lord Ashmore did not call her attention to it. He spoke, after a silence, in the way of a man who had been holding something for a long time, and found that the room was quiet enough to set it down. He was the better musician, he said. He had a better temperament for most things. I was better at making enemies. He was looking at the portrait, not at her. He kept the key to this library on a chain. He said it was because I was always losing mine. He glanced at his wrist where a small iron key hung on a thin chain she had noticed from the first week. I told him it was absurd. He kept it anyway. When he died, they found it on the writing table beside him. And he stopped. I took it. She was watching the side of his face. He was not someone who spoke about himself easily. She had understood that from the first morning. The words cost him something, and he paid them deliberately, the way he paid attention to things, without flourish. She thought, tell him now. About the apothecary's report, about Crane's letters. She thought about the magistrate's patient smile. She thought about being dismissed before she could show him the evidence, before she could arrange it in the right order, before she had made it impossible to unknow. She said, "He sounds as though he was worth knowing." My lord! Lord Ashmore said he was. His voice was level and factual, the way the truth sometimes sounds when it is too simple to embellish. He was the best of us. She left the study with the tray and the report folded in her dress, and she told herself she would find the right moment, and she acknowledged quietly to herself that she was also afraid of what the right moment would cost, not just strategically, but personally, and that the personal cost was the harder one to calculate. It was Lady Ashmore who forced her hand. The Dowager Viscountess had never been comfortable with Clara Marsh's presence in the upper household. From the first week, she had found reasons to mention it to Crane. The girl's posture was too upright, her speech too precise, her manner of looking at things too direct for a woman in service. She had said in the small sitting room she used for private conversations that she found Clara unsettling, in a way she could not name. She watches, the Dowager had said. Servants should not watch. Crane had listened with the particular attentiveness of a man who stored information, and he had said smoothly, "She is only the servant girl. Do not let her trouble you, my lady." Cecily knew this because Mrs. Brest, Pattinson told her quietly. On the morning after the conversation had taken place, Mrs. Bacher. Pattinson was the kind of woman who knew everything that moved through a house. It was the particular gift of housekeepers who had been in service long enough to have become invisible to the people who most needed to be watched. By the 7th week, Crane had begun to notice Cecily's own watching. She had been as careful as she knew how to be. Crane was not a careless man, which was why he had gone undiscovered for as long as he had, and he possessed the specific alertness of someone whose life depended on remaining unobserved. He had registered, she understood now, that she watched the sideboard. He had registered that she was present at the table more often than her duties strictly required. He had registered the day she had not been in the kitchen when she should have been, which was the day she had taken the decanter to the village. At the midsummer dinner, 3 days before the gathering, he had spoken to Lord Ashmore with the smoothness of long practice. "I wonder, my lord, if the upper household is perhaps overstaffed at present. Your lordship should not waste his attention on the servant girl's fancies. She is overwrought, I think, from the Thomas business." Lord Ashmore had said that Clara had handled Thomas's illness with considerable competence, and Crane had agreed pleasantly, and said only that he wondered if her energies might be better directed, and the conversation had moved on. But Crane had looked at Cecily across the room as he spoke, and the look had been brief and direct, and had held the particular quality of someone who was not alarmed, but who had made a decision, and she had understood then that she had less time than she had thought. The morning of the midsummer gathering, the Dowager came to her room at 9:30. She told her, with the decisive civility of a woman accustomed to being obeyed, that her services were no longer required at Ashmore Park. She had a week's wages. She had arranged for the carrier to take the cases to the village the following morning. She expected the room to be vacated by nightfall. Before she left, she said, "Gideon's secretary mentioned you had been making yourself conspicuous in parts of the house that were not your concern. Mrs. Pattinson spoke in your defense, but the household has its proprieties." She paused, arranging the sentence with the precision of a woman who intended it to close the subject permanently. The servant girl ought to be dismissed before she makes a nuisance of herself. "I am afraid that is simply the conclusion we have reached." She closed the door. Cecily stood in her small room for precisely 3 minutes. She had the apothecary's report. She had Crane's letter from Bath. She had the ledger pages, the arsenic purchases, Crane's initials in the margin. She had the substituted decanter correctly labeled, that she had kept in a locked case under her bed for 3 weeks. She had 8 weeks of careful observation assembled into a sequence that any rational person with 2 eyes and the willingness to use them could follow. She was being sent away in the morning with a week's wages and the household's assessment that she was a servant girl who had made a nuisance of herself. She thought about her father's cold hand. She thought about Edmund Ashmore, who had begun to look into it, and had not had enough time. She thought about the midsummer gathering, the port, the assembled guests, The magistrate she knew was among them because she had read the invitation list in the morning room on the day it arrived. She put on the gray cloak. It was still too large, it did not matter. She picked up the locked case and went downstairs, not to the servants' gate, to the front of the house. The midsummer dinner was at its port stage. She could hear the assembled guests through the closed double doors, the particular suspended quality of her room, settled into its after-dinner ease. She approached the footman at the door and gave the locked case into his keeping, and told him she required a moment with Lord Ashmore on a matter that could not wait. When he began to explain that Lord Ashmore was engaged with his guests, she said, very quietly and very clearly, "Tell him Clara Marsh is at the door, and that she has information about how Edmund died." The footman looked at her face and went. She stood in the entrance hall in the gray cloak and waited. The case was out of her hands, which made her feel, briefly, entirely exposed. She pressed her palms together inside the cloak and attended to her own breathing and did not let herself think about what happened if it did not work. The double doors opened. Lord Ashmore came through them himself. He looked at her in the entrance hall light, and she looked at him. And she knew from his face that the footman had delivered the message exactly as she had given it. The name of his brother, still raw, in his chest. His expression was not the careful reserve he wore for the dining room. It was something more complicated, and much older, and she thought that if she had had any remaining uncertainty about whether she was right, she would not have had it now. She said, "Your cousin has been poisoning your port for at least 4 months. Your brother died by the same method. I have the evidence. I have an apothecary's report correspondence in Crane's hand and a decanter of your port that I substituted 6 weeks ago, and have kept since. I can show you all of it, my lord. I ask only that you look at it before you send me away." The silence in the entrance hall was very complete. Behind him, through the open doors, she was aware of the dining room holding itself very still. He said, "How long have you known since the 5th week of my employment, my lord?" "And before that, I suspected. Before I arrived. That is why I came." He was very quiet for a moment. She watched him think, which was something she had learned to recognize. It was the quality of his stillness when his mind was moving faster than his face. He looked at the locked case. He looked at her, he said, "The magistrate is among my guests this evening." "Yes, my lord, I know." "I thought it possible you had arranged that yourself." He had not. She could see that he had not. She could see also that the information settled something in him, that it completed a shape he had been trying to see from the wrong angle. He reached out and took the locked case from the footman's hands. Then he turned back into the dining room, and his voice, when he spoke, was the voice he used when something had already been decided. "Mr. Tate," he said, "I have need of you." The next half hour was procedural and very quiet. Crane denied everything with the practiced calm of a man who had planned for discovery, but Lord Ashmore set the case on the table and opened it without looking at Crane and Mr. Sayer. Tate read the apothecary's report in the silence of the gathered guests, and looked at Crane's face and said, with the measured certainty of a magistrate who had learned to trust precise documentary evidence over social assurance, "Mr. Potter, Crane, I think you and I had better have a conversation elsewhere." 2 guests rose to accompany them. The door closed behind them. The dining room exhaled. Lord Ashmore was still at the head of the table. He stood with the empty case and looked at the closed door. And then he looked at Cecily, who had remained at the edge of the room in the gray cloak. Lady Ashmore said from her chair, "Who is this woman?" Lord Ashmore set the case down on the table. He walked the length of the room without haste, past his seated guests, the candles throwing his shadow long and certain behind him. And he stopped in front of Cecily. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked at him, and she thought she could feel the specific weight of 8 weeks of careful distance being set down between them. He reached up and took the gray cloak from her shoulders, and in its place he settled his own coat around her, heavier and warmer and carrying the faint wood-smoke smell of the evening, and he turned to the room with the quiet finality of a man who had measured the cost of this moment and paid it. "She is no servant," he said. "She is the woman who saved my life." 12 words. The room received them in the silence that follows a verdict long overdue. Lady Ashmore said Gideon, and stopped, and the stopping was a more significant event than anything she might have said, because Lady Ashmore was a woman who was accustomed to having words available to her in every situation, and they had gone. Cecily did not move. She was not certain she could. She was aware of the coat on her shoulders and the room's attention and the specific quality of Lord Ashmore's gaze, which was the attention he had been paying to things all along, steadily and without announcement, and which was now turned on her without the careful distance she had come to expect. She said very quietly, "You had worked it out yourself," he said. "I had begun to. I was waiting for the evidence." A pause. "I was also waiting for you to tell me. I was afraid you would not believe me." "I know," he said. "I am sorry that it took this long for you to have reason to think I might." The guests were finding reasons to excuse themselves. The careful retreat of people who understood that they were witnessing something that required privacy and would be spoken of at considerable length at a later date. Lady Ashmore remained in her chair. She had the expression of a woman rearranging a very large number of things very quickly, and finding the rearrangement both more difficult and more necessary than she had expected. Cecily said, "My name is Cecily Fairbrook. My father was Mr. Jonathan Fairbrook of Northamptonshire. He died 2 years ago under the same circumstances as your brother." Lord Ashmore was quiet for a moment. "I know the name. Edmund mentioned him in a letter from the winter. He said he was looking into several deaths. He looked at the iron key at his wrist. He did not tell me directly. He said he wanted to be certain first." "He was always careful about certainty," she said. "He was. He wrote to me from Vienna and said he had found something that might be of consequence, and that he would explain it when I returned." His voice was steady. She could hear beneath the steadiness the thing the steadiness was holding. "I returned in April. She had arrived in April. She said he was careful, and it was not enough because Crane did not give him time. I'm sorry." He said, "You gave him more time. You gave me time." He looked at her. "That is not a small thing, Miss Fairbrook." "Cecily," she said, because they had passed the point at which formality served a purpose, and she was tired, suddenly, of being careful, and she thought that he was too. "Cecily," he said, the name placed with the same deliberateness he gave to everything, and she felt it settle, the first sound of her own name in 8 weeks. The rest of the evening passed in the careful rhythm of official things. Tate's statement, the documents, the 2 guests who remained as witnesses, the arrangements for the following day. Lord Ashmore managed all of it without theatre, and Cecily sat in a chair by the fireplace, still wearing his coat, and answered the questions asked of her, and signed what needed signing. When the last of the guests had gone, and the fire had burned to a quieter heat, he came and stood beside her chair and said nothing for a moment. She said, "I should tell you the rest of it." "Yes," he said, "but not tonight." He looked at her. "Tonight I think you should rest." She almost said that she was perfectly well. She did not, because she was not perfectly well. She was exhausted, in the precise way of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down, and because he was looking at her with the attention, she had stopped trying to explain to herself, and she thought that she had spent 8 weeks being careful about this in particular, and that the careful thing was no longer required. She said, "When will you want to speak to my cousin about the estate?" He said, "As soon as the solicitor can be arranged." She said, "The cousin is very fond of money." He said, "I know what cousins cost." And she felt something shift in his voice. A very small shift, the kind that only someone who had been listening closely for 2 months would have heard. And she thought that this was what passed for levity in him. It was a small, fractional ease, offered like a key, that was finally being used. She said, "I was the daughter of a country gentleman with a modest estate, and a good library and a better opinion of people than the evidence strictly warranted. You should know that before you speak to the solicitor." He said, "I know what you are. I have had 8 weeks to observe it at close range." He was quiet a moment. "It is, I find, considerably more than sufficient." She did not answer. She was not certain she had the words for what she wanted to say, and she thought that he did not require words at the moment, that he was a man who was comfortable with silence in the way of someone who had learned to live in it, and that this was in fact one of the things about him that she had come to value most. The gray cloak was folded over the back of the chair beside her where she had placed it. When she sat down, she looked at it. Plain wool, a half-size too large, worn through at the elbows, the garment of a servant girl who had needed to disappear into a household and had done so entirely. It had held everything. It had done its work. She did not think she would need it again in this house. She left it on the chair when they went out. It seemed the right thing to do. Tate returned the following morning with 2 constables and a formal statement to be signed, and the business of the law began its long, methodical passage through the proper channels. Pattinson stood in the entrance hall when Cecily came downstairs and said nothing, only took her hand for a moment and held it, and that was sufficient for both of them. The summer stretched out quietly after that. There was a great deal of correspondence, and a solicitor from London, and several visits to magistrates' offices where no one smiled at her patiently, because Lord Ashmore was beside her, and Lord Ashmore did not invite patient smiles. The case against Crane assembled itself with the slow gravity of official things, and Cecily answered every question asked of her and provided every document she had, and after the 3rd hearing, she thought her father would have been glad to know it had been done properly at last. They visited Northamptonshire in late July, a journey of 3 days. On the 3rd afternoon, Cecily stood in the park of her father's former house in the summer heat, and said goodbye to it in the way she had not had time to do when she left. She said it without ceremony, which was how her father would have wanted it. Lord Ashmore stood beside her and said nothing, and she was aware of his particular quality of silence, which was not emptiness, but the specific steadiness of a person making room for what was needed, and she thought that she had spent 2 years trying to do the work alone, and that standing beside someone whose silence was useful was a different thing than she had expected it to be. Edmund's portrait was rehung on the north wall of the study without the velvet curtain. Lord Ashmore did not explain why. He left the key on its chain. The legal proceedings moved as such things moved, thoroughly and slowly. By the time the first autumn chill came to Ashmore Park, the outcome had been determined in all the ways that mattered. Cecily had begun to learn the house from a different angle than the servants' stairs and the upper corridor. She had learned the rooms that held the morning light, and the rooms where the quiet gathered in the evenings. And she had learned which chair by the library fire Lord Ashmore preferred, and that he turned pages more slowly when something had genuinely caught him, and that he drank his tea while it was still too hot, because he was impatient about very specific things while being patient about almost everything else. She had told him one November evening about every piece of evidence she had assembled across 2 years and every door it had failed to open, the full account of it, beginning with the coroner's report and ending with the solicitor's in London. He had listened without the patient smile which she had known he would, and when she finished he said, "You should have had a better magistrate," and she said, "I know," and they were both quiet in the way of people who know the next sentence is too large for any room and who have agreed without discussion to let it rest beside them for a while. The iron key caught the firelight. She watched it turn gently at his wrist. She had begun in the evenings to play the piano in the East Room, which faced the direction Edmund had liked. She played imperfectly, with the hesitations of a woman who had not had regular practice in 2 years. And her mistakes were audible, and she did not try to hide them. Lord Ashmore listened from the doorway without comment, which she had not expected of him, and which she valued more than she would have known how to say. On one particular evening, she stopped mid-phrase. The note simply stopped, because she had lost the thread of it, and she sat with her hands in her lap and felt the particular frustration of knowing where the music was supposed to go and being unable to get there. He said without looking up from his book, "You may finish." "I lost the thread," she said. "Find it again," he said. "There is time." She found it. The note rang out into the quiet room and held, and then the phrase continued. Imperfect still but present, moving through to where it had always intended to go. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall against the east-facing windows, small and unhurried, the kind of snow that did not ask anything of anyone, that simply settled over what was there and made it briefly, perfectly still. She played to the end. She did not rush it. The last note was a small sound in a large room, and it was followed by silence, and the silence was warm. There was time. There was, at last, enough of it. If Cecily's story has stayed with you this evening, leave a word in the comments below. Thank you for listening until the very end.